pleasure to kick off the human-animal interaction speaker series of the College of Veterinary Medicine at the University of Arizona with today's speaker, Francois Lanoe, also professor at the University of Arizona. Before I'll introduce him, I'd like to say one sentence about the speaker series. The speaker series has been going on for several years now. We've been very happy to feature an interdisciplinary group of scholars and scientists to talk about human-animal relationships and interaction and the consequences and the benefits of such. My name is Martin Reimann. I'm a professor at the College of Veterinary Medicine and also at the Eller College at the University of Arizona, and I've had the pleasure and have the pleasure to chair this series for a number of years. Today, I'm really excited to have Francois as our speaker today. Francois has a very interesting background in archaeology and does interdisciplinary work along those lines. Francois is a professor at the University of Arizona and does very interesting work at the intersection of anthropology and also recently human-animal interaction. And looking at his CV, Francois has a very impressive record of publications in the very top journals, including Science and Science Advances, and many of the great journals in archaeology. And also of note, an amazing success landing grant funding. So that's very, very impressive. The floor is all yours, Francois, and we were looking forward to the talk. And Francois told me that he appreciates questions either during the talk or at the end. And so um, feel free to basically raise your hand and ask a question. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Martin. Thanks for the kind introduction. And it's going to be funny. I see that half of the people in this talk have pictures of dogs on their profile picture. So I see where the interest is coming from. But yeah, I really appreciate being invited to talk here. And can you see my slides? Is it working?
Not yet.
Oh, oh, I have to share it from Zoom, right?
Please.
Let's see. Is it working now?
Yes, perfect.
Okay, let's try this. Oop. Just let me know if it stops for one reason or the other showing. If you just see my face, that's not what it's supposed to be.
Looks great.
Okay, so I'll talk about people, canids, and salmon in ancient Alaska. And, so I'm Francois Lanoe, but I'm really presenting on behalf of a lot of my colleagues. Many of them work at the University of Alaska in Fairbanks and at the University of Alaska Museum of the North, and some of them are listed here on this slide. Oops. So I'll talk about Alaska. I presume most people here know where that is located, and native Alaska, really. This is a map of what native people are in Alaska today and where they are. And I'll give some names of native people during the talk. I'll talk about the Inupiaq, who live in the north of Alaska, and the Yupik in the southwest, and the Dene as well, or Dene, who are also known as Athabascan speakers, who are all these people who are in red and yellow in the interior of the state. Martin, can you see my cursor when I move it on the screen?
Yes, I can.
Okay, okay. Oops, thanks. And in the north, canids, there's a long tradition of relationship between people and canids there. On one side, we have dogs. Dogs and people have a very long tradition of mutual support in Alaska and in the Arctic and in the subarctic in general. And dogs have fulfilled a number of roles for native people there. One of them is perhaps the one that comes to mind the most is transportation. In the interior where I work a lot, help in transportation that mostly comes in the form of pack sacks, so putting bags on the back of dogs, and they carry your stuff, the stuff of people for them. This is an illustration on the right from DNA people in the interior, not far from Fairbanks in the 40s. Oops. And in the more recent past in the interior, the transportation has also taken the form of sledding, something that perhaps we have more in mind when we think about dogs in Alaska. Sledding has a lot of antiquity on the coast, more about Yupik and Inupiaq people. And again, in Alaska, it is a thing these days. It's a little more recent. It started more after European contact in the 1800s, but it's definitely a thing today and continues to be a thing. Dog sledding remains a big thing in Alaska. Not so much for moving goods anymore, but perhaps more for racing. It's a major sport up there. Native people participate into dog sledding quite a bit and take a lot of pride into raising dog teams and participating in events. This is one example of the biggest event, the biggest racing event in Alaska, the Iditarod race that goes from Anchorage to the Bering Strait area. And one native musher that participated in it a few years ago. So transportation is one function of dogs in the north. Another big one is hunting, and I struggled a little bit to find a picture of a hunting dog in Alaska. I'm not sure why, but this is an example from an archaeological specimen from the coast, from the Yupik or Inupiaq area, that shows how dogs were helping people in the fairly recent past in hunting, particularly bears. But dogs help people in hunting all kind of animals, moose or caribou in the interior, or birds as well. Oh. And beyond transportation and hunting, which are two big ones, dogs take a role in human-dog interactions in form of guarding. They guard human settlements. And of course, they are companions who are loved by their owners, and they reciprocate that love. And some of it comes in the form of play, either between dogs or between humans and dogs, and particularly between children and dogs. And here, depicted here, are two illustrations of dogs engaging in more domestic activities, again amongst the Inupiaq, the Inuit on the coast. The Inupiat. Oh, keeping an eye on time. Okay. Dogs are not the only canids in Alaska. Of course, there are wolves as well, and wolves do interact with people, did interact with people in the past. It's a different kind of relationship. It's mostly a relationship of competition and predation. So people compete with wolves for access to prey, and also prey on wolves occasionally. Not so much for meat, but for their fur. And again, these are illustrations from Inupiaq artifacts about the kind of ecological relationship that there has been between wolves and people. One of competition when people go for the same prey for caribou, or one of predation when wolf furs end up in human settlements. And beyond that, in a more symbolic level, many native Alaskans have a lot of respect for wolves, and partly, I think, and the Native American, the Native Alaskans I've talked to, that stems from an awareness that people and wolves are very similar. They're very social animals. They go for the similar kind of lifestyle, a similar kind of prey. And that relationship of respect and mutual similarities, in many Native Alaskan cosmologies, it's reflected in wolves have a similar role than people in some of the cosmologies. And in some cases, wolves are considered as people themselves. And this is an example from one of the Dene tribes, the Koyukon tribe in the interior, and how they think about wolves as similar, very similar to people. And I'll give you 10 seconds also to read it. All right. So one big question that my colleagues have had over the past few years is that knowledge that we have that canids, whether they're dogs or wolves, play a big part in native Alaskan life, is when did it start? What's the antiquity of that? And I'm going to situate us in time a little bit. So I'm talking about Alaska, and in Alaska, we have evidence of people being there for at least 14,000 years, and that's a little disputed, but it started at least towards the end of the Ice Age, perhaps a little bit before. For a frame of reference, European colonization in Alaska took place about 200 years ago, a little more than 200 years ago, depending where in the state. And if we compare to the timeline of dog domestication, so we don't really know when dog domestication first occurred. A lot of people think it occurred sometime in the Ice Age as well, perhaps about 20,000 years ago. But the earliest firm evidence that we have for domesticated dogs dates also from the end of the Ice Age, about 14 or 13,000 years ago, and that's in Europe, that's in Germany and Switzerland, in the home country of Martin. In the Americas, it's a similar story. We don't really know when the first dogs came, but we do know when we have the earliest evidence of dogs, and those are about 10,000 years old. And they're in the middle of the continent, they're in the Midwest, in Illinois. In Alaska itself, before my colleagues and I started looking into this, the earliest dogs that we know of are only a few hundred years old and were associated with a late pre-contact settlement on the coasts in Inuit, Inupiaq, and Yupik territory. So what my colleagues and I got interested in and what I'm going to talk about today stems from extending a little bit that time frame, and it really started because we were engaging in doing archaeological fieldwork, in doing excavations, and we happened to find a number of canid archaeological specimens in archaeological sites in interior Alaska that were very old compared to what we knew before, and that dated from that early period of human presence in Alaska from about 14,000 to 8,000 years ago. At the very end of the Ice Age and at the beginning of the Holocene, the interglacial that we're in right now. So I'm going to talk about specimens that we found at an excavation that I've been directing with my colleague Josh Ruther. It's called the Hollenbach Hill site, and it's depicted here on the right during the excavation 2 years ago. It's located in the interior of Alaska, between Fairbanks and the Yukon border. And I'll talk as well about another site that's located very near Hollenbach Hill site, and that's been excavated by my colleagues Josh Ruther again and Charles Holmes. And that's a little bit older with a canid specimen dating from 14 to 12,000 years ago. Are there any questions so far?
Maybe I have a quick question as a non-archaeologist. How do you pick a site like this?
It's a good question. So how do we find sites maybe? Usually we're interested in finding sites from a certain time period. I'm interested, for instance, in old sites dating from about 10,000 years ago or older. It's very simple. We take a geological map and look for sediments that date from that time on the map, and then go test those sites just by digging holes in the ground with a shovel. Most of the time we don't find anything, and every now and then we find some material that tells us that there's an archaeological site. And occasionally that archaeological site may be dense and provide a lot of materials. Is that what you're asking?
Yes, thank you.
Mm-hmm. All right, I'll keep going. I'll talk a little bit as an archaeologist or in archaeology about how to identify dogs, and it's not straightforward at all because of the nature of the material we're dealing with. There are a number of ways to do it. One of them is to look into ancient DNA, so from a purely biological perspective, and that's kind of the method that's been the most in the news because perhaps that's the method that can be the most satisfying depending on the kind of data that you have that can give the clearest answer on whether the specimen that you have is a dog or a wolf. And the way to do this is really to extract DNA from the specimen you have and try to establish the genetic relationship with known dog lineages and known wolf lineages. And based on the proximity with one lineage on the other, argue that your specimen is a dog or a wolf. There's actually quite a few dog lineages that we know of out there. Depicted on this figure are 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 of them. They're noted A, B, C, D, and a few of them are not labeled yet. This is based on mitochondrial DNA. It's a little different with the whole genome DNA picture. Just to give you an idea that it's not that straightforward because of the number of lineages, and these are the lineages that we know about. We don't really know how many dog lineages there were in the past, and we don't really know how many wolf lineages there were in the past as well. It's very fragmentary knowledge. Another way to look at dogs versus wolves, again from a biological perspective, is just to look at what they looked like, at their morphology. And there's kind of a rule of thumb here, is that dogs tend to be smaller than wolves, and they also tend to have reduced faces, and I think that's clear to all of us. A pug looks very different from a wolf. Their faces look very different. And we can measure that in archaeological specimens. This is an example from these very early dogs in Illinois in the Midwest that date to 10,000 years ago. We can see based on the length of the carnassial molar, the first molar here on the bottom, that dogs from that site are very much smaller than wolves. They're on the left side of the graph. But compared to coyotes, which are very similar morphologically to wolves, they're also a different shape because the height of their mandible is taller, so they have a stouter or shorter snouts than coyotes, proportionally to size. And that's an excellent way to tell a dog from a wolf archaeologically, if your specimen is well preserved enough that you can make these kind of measurements. Another way to look at it, if beyond biology, is to look at behavior, because dogs in archaeological sites tend to be treated differently from other animals. They tend to have special treatment in death, and many dogs are found in burials. So they're treated in a very similar ways than people. Again, this is an example from these very early dogs in Illinois that were buried with grave goods, if I remember correctly, as opposed to finishing in a trash pile, which is where most archaeological bones end up going in most archaeological sites. Special treatment in death, and oftentimes special treatment in life as well. And I'll get back to it when I talk about Alaska in a minute. So to go back to the canid remains that we studied in Alaska, we tried to do all of that to establish whether they were dogs or wolves, and we looked at their DNA. That was not very satisfying. We had very little of it, very fragmentary DNA, only mitochondrial DNA, not whole genome DNA. And again, the results that we got is that they looked the most like wolves, the wolves that we know today, but we don't really know how they compare to wolves of that time, of 14,000 to 8,000 years ago. And we don't really know how they compare to dogs at that time that were known on the other side of the Bering Strait in Siberia. If we did look at morphology as well, and we got very similar results than DNA. We're dealing with archaeological bones, so most of them are very fragmented and we cannot make very accurate measurements. A lot of the bones we looked at were actually from neonate individuals. These are the bones pictured on the right, the three bones and the tooth pictured on the right. And these are great, but it's hard to get information about the morphology of an adult individual based on fetal or neonate bones. Mostly because the bones are not fully formed and the epiphysis, the articulations, the bone articulations are not formed yet. So we did get some morphological information, and like DNA, it told us that it looked the most like wolves. All the specimens for which we could say something looked the most like wolves. But again, like DNA, they look like the wolves that we know of today, and they do not look like the dogs that we know of today. But we don't really know how they compare to wolves or dogs that lived near Alaska 14 to 10,000 years ago. So just looking at the specimens from a purely biological perspective was a little unsatisfying. And for one thing, it doesn't say anything about their behavior and how they interacted with people. How did these specimens end up in archaeological sites, whether people hunted them in the wild or whether people hunted canids, animals that were hanging around archaeological sites, perhaps to eat the scrap and the trash that people left behind them, so something that we would call commensalism from an ecological standpoint, or whether these animals were companions to people at the time. So in order to look at behavior for our specimens, we had to look into diet. We just didn't have any information about burial or not. And for archaeological specimens, we looked into stable isotope composition, so the chemical composition of the bones we found, particularly the stable isotope ratios of two elements, carbon and nitrogen. I'm not really going to get into details of how the method works because it could take an hour itself. But and I'm sure many people in this talk know about this. But the isotopic composition of bones suffices to say that it reflects the diet of the individual whose bones we're talking of, and especially their protein intake, which for carnivores like dogs and wolves is a good representation of their diet as a whole. In interior Alaska, stable isotopes are particularly interesting because they enable us to separate very clearly foods that are terrestrial, and these are some examples of terrestrial or land foods in interior Alaska that canids may have eaten. That includes moose and caribou, moose more in the forest, caribou more in the tundra, and also smaller mammals like snowshoe hare or game fowl, animals that rely on terrestrial, birds that rely on terrestrial resources like ptarmigan. And also for the earlier canids, things like extinct Pleistocene animals like mammals, who have a very similar isotopic signature. So we can tell apart these terrestrial foods from, so terrestrial foods, that tends to be associated more with a wolf diet in interior Alaska. And we can tell terrestrial foods from marine foods, from foods that have a marine isotopic signature. And in the interior Alaska, we're pretty far from the sea. So when we talk about marine foods, we're really talking about salmon. Those are animals that spend most of their life in the North Pacific Ocean, but that come in interior Alaska upriver during selected months of the summer. These are depicted here, the three species of salmon that come to interior Alaska Chinook salmon on the top right, chum salmon on the top left, and coho salmon in the bottom. In interior Alaska, marine food salmon tends to be more of a people diet or a dog diet because dogs tend to eat the same thing than people. And people in the recent past, we know that they've had a tradition of curing salmon, storing salmon through the winter, and relying on salmon food for themselves and their dogs for a big part of the year. In terms of methods, very quickly, to get an idea of the diet of archaeological canid specimens, we measured the isotopic signature of their potential foods, which are depicted in the graph on the right here. So terrestrial foods such as moss are concentrated in the bottom part of the graph, whereas marine food, salmon, have a much higher D13C carbon isotopic ratio and a much higher nitrogen isotopic ratio as well. We measured the isotopic signature of canids and then just used statistical models of dietary estimates to estimate how much terrestrial food canids ate in the past and how much marine food, how much salmon canids of the past ate as well. Are there any questions so far? Should I continue? If there are questions, I suppose I cannot see the chat, so if there are questions in the chat, someone will have to read them for me.
There are currently no questions in the chat, but I did have a question, if I may. So,
Yeah, please.
in your work with the Alaskan canids, so what evidence do you find regarding the interaction between the human population and and the dogs, or how is that established?
I'll get to that in a minute if you don't
Okay,
mind.
I thought so. Thanks.
No one else? All right, I'll keep going. So to get to our results about diet of canids in the past, we looked at wolves. My colleague and I looked at wolves in interior Alaska. We looked at the stable isotopic signature of wolves through time. So here on the graph in the right, we have a time scale going from modern time at the bottom, 0, to 25,000 years ago during the height of the Ice Age. And during that time, we found that wolves kept fully terrestrial diet. So they do show around 5 or 10% here, but it's because of the standard deviation, because of the way the model works. If we extend the standard deviation to 2 standard deviation, they have 0% marine intake. So they had terrestrial diet, which makes sense. That's how wolves in the interior behave today. They hunt caribou, they hunt moose, they subsist on this kind of food. Some wolves in Alaska do fish. That's something that many people in Alaska know and keep telling me about, but not necessarily outside of Alaska. This is a beautiful picture of a wolf eating a salmon, but that's not really the case in interior Alaska where we worked. Fishing is more of a coastal thing because there's more salmon available in the coast and they're available for a bigger chunk of the year. So wolves can subsist on salmon for a big part of their diet there. If we look at recent dogs in interior Alaska, they look very different from wolves. We can find that the marine part of their diet varies a lot from essentially 0% at 2 standard deviation to almost 100%, again at 2 standard deviation. And it shows that dogs in the recent past, some were very much like wolves, had purely terrestrial diets. Some were at the other end of the spectrum, were essentially salmon specialists and probably were fed throughout the year on cured and stored salmon. So salmon that people fished and cured throughout the winter and fed to their dogs throughout the winter. And some of them probably had a mixed diet of both terrestrial foods and marine food. And that's probably most of the dogs lived like that. This on the left is just a close-up of the graph showing the archaeological dogs that we know of for the last 700 years. So very recent dogs. When we looked at the canids we were most interested in, the canids that date from 8,000 to 14,000 years ago, it was really interesting. That diet came out very similar to recent dogs, very diverse, going from canids that were essentially terrestrial specialists, with a diet very similar to wolf that we can tell from an isotopic standpoint, to canids on the right side of the graph that seem to have been specializing on salmon in very much the same way than recent dogs of the last 700 years. And this on the left is an example of a salmon specialist, of a dog, or not necessarily a dog, of a canid that subsisted almost exclusively on salmon 8,000 years ago in interior Alaska. The fishing, from what we can tell, it's a very low sample size, of course, but did not seem to occur in the earlier sites around 14,000 years ago, but seems to have started only about 13 to 12,000 years ago. It's quite interesting, actually, because that's about the same time that people started eating fish in interior Alaska. So people have been in interior Alaska for 14,000 years, but at first they did not eat any fish that we can tell. They only started eating fish about 13,000 years ago. And we know that because we find those fish remains in archaeological sites. For instance, that mandible of a salmon from an 8,000-year-old archaeological site in interior Alaska. And we also know that because we do occasionally find human remains in interior Alaska archaeological sites, and we can do the same kind of isotopic analysis on them to estimate their diet. And starting at 12,000 years ago, we find that people ate a lot of salmon, and that's isotopically visible, that has left an isotopic signature in their bones. And this is an example with the remains of two children that were found at a site in interior Alaska, not so far from Hollenbach Hill or from Swan Point, and that came back with a diet of more than 25% consisting of salmon. So what can we say about the ecology or the behavior of these canids that are dated to 8,000 to 14,000 years ago, and that appear to have eaten substantial amounts of salmon and possibly subsisted exclusively on salmon? So possibly there were fishing wolves, like on the coast, so wolves that were fishing themselves, and that people just happened to hunt and then leave their remains on archaeological sites. And I think it's unlikely for the reasons that I've mentioned before. We've looked at the diet of wolves in interior Alaska for the last 20,000 years. And from what we can tell, wolves have never done that in interior Alaska. They didn't do it 20,000 years ago. They don't do it today. And fishing is only a coastal behavior. And in fact, wolves would not be able to subsist on fish in interior Alaska because it's a seasonal phenomenon. Salmon is only available during 2 months of the summer. We found a very telling bone that talks to this. So one of the canids that we found that's about 8,000 years old and that subsisted on salmon comes from that neonate that's pictured on the right. So because it's a neonate, that individual specifically did not eat salmon, but it got its isotopic signature from its mother, and that was transferred in utero. So the mother of that individual ate salmon, specialized on salmon at the time that bone was formed in utero, so sometime in the winter or early spring, and salmons are not available in the summer in that part of Alaska, in the winter or early spring. So the mother of that individual probably subsisted on stored salmon and was fed directly by people. Another possibility is that those salmon-eating canids were commensal canids, were wild animals that were just hanging around human settlements and eating their fish scraps. And again, I don't think it's very likely because the canids we're talking about seem to have been specializing on salmon, so eating most of the diet from salmon for most of the year. And it's hard to quantify, but I don't think they could reach that amount of salmon specialization if they were just subsisting on human scraps. I don't think that's possible. And the third possibility, which I think is the most likely, is that those canids that we're finding were fed salmon directly by people. So were engaged in a mutualistic relationship with people at the time. And were eating salmon through the winter, so from a cured and stored salmon. Mutualism in that case could mean two things. It could mean domesticated dogs or wolves or tamed wolves that were interacting with people, something akin to a pet wild animal, which is a thing among some hunter-gatherer populations. Some hunter-gatherer people do tame wild animals and they hang out around people, even though those are not domesticated. And one of those two could have happened in our sites in Alaska 8,000 to 14,000 years ago. And we don't really know which one it could be. It is really interesting from that perspective that the DNA and the morphological analysis that we do of our remains suggests that they're not related to the dog populations that we know of, which might suggest that the individuals we're dealing with are more likely to be tamed wolves, but it's hard to tell with the data that we have so far. If we go back to the other canids that we find at archaeological sites, some of our canids ate a lot of salmon and specialized in salmons, and some of our canids did not and appear to have been eating mostly terrestrial foods. And it's a lot harder to say anything about the behavior of those guys, or about their ecology, the kind of ecological relationship that they had with people. Diet itself, in this case, that does not allow us to tease apart predation from commensalism, from mutualism. So we don't really know what kind of ecological relationship these canids who subsisted exclusively on terrestrial food engaged in with people. Nope, we cannot tell. There we go. So what can we say about people and canid relationship in the deep past in interior Alaska? We can say that there were probably dynamic and complex ecological and behavioral relationship going on between those two taxa, and again, regardless of what canid taxon we're dealing with, whether they're dogs or wolves. And in many ways, it's really interesting because it's very similar to the kind of ecological relationships that native Alaskans have with canids today in interior Alaska. A lot of native Alaskans have dogs, and some of those dogs are fed exclusively terrestrial resources. Some of those dogs are fed exclusively salmon resources, as on the picture in the top right, and some of these dogs are fed a mix of both. But native Alaskans also engage with different kind of canids. They hunt wolves and coyotes. Coyotes are fairly recent arrival in interior Alaska. Some of those hunts occur away from human settlements, or some of those occur very near to human settlements because the canids are commensal and hang around human settlements. And they also interact with wolves and coyotes in different ways, including crossbreeding their dogs with wolves or taming wolves, having pet wolves around. So it might be what we are seeing in the deep past is very similar to what we are seeing in the recent past, and it really shows, again, in my opinion, the deep antiquity of the kind of ecological and behavioral relationship that native Alaskans have had with canids.